Welcome, it's Frances here. Thank you for coming back to my channel. If this is your first time here, I bid thee welcome. There is a subscribe button below if you would like to help support this channel by subscribing, and also a bell to be notified as to when I upload more content. I'm coming to you from Ghana country, and as such I acknowledge the Ghana people of the Adelaide Plains as being the traditional custodians of this land. So I've actually been sitting on this video for about a week now, wondering whether I should get involved, like saying my 2 cents worth, because there has been a little bit of controversy around it. However, I thought I would go ahead and do this video anyway, because what's sort of being raised in my own mind is something that I haven't yet seen people discuss. Now, I would suppose I would have to do a disclaimer first. I'm not a professional in this area. I'm not a psychologist, counsellor, psychiatrist, any way, shape or form. I do past life regression. I do hypnotherapy and energetics and that sort of work as well, which you can find all about me and what I do through my website, Mystical Soul Academy, which is listed below. And also, I guess, considering the topic that and what I want to discuss, there will be a trigger warning. So if you don't like being triggered, depending on your level of sensitivities, you might just want to pause and maybe not go any further with this video. But in saying that, this video, and I'm already stumbling over my words, it's more of some thoughts that have been going through my head since this controversy erupted. And what I'm talking about is the removal, relocation, which is what's happened, of an art installation in the Chalice Well Gardens. So there's a bit of a backstory, and I don't think everything has actually been brought into public awareness when this first sort of hit the scenes last week. But it does, to me at least, raise a whole lot of questions. So the statue in question, if you are sort of new to and don't know what's happening, is that entitled Mother and Child. And I do have an image of it here that I will just share for a moment. And you can see the image there of Mother and Child. So this statue in particular is created by the artist, I think his name is Ganesh. That's how you pronounce the Indian god with the same name, a similar name. However, it's not with the artist himself that the problem lies. It's actually is the inspiration behind this statue. Just stop screening, share my screen for a moment, which is and a very prominent artist from the 20th century, a sculptor by the name of Eric Gill. Now, Eric Gill died in the 1940s, and when his diaries were published, they contained or alluded to possible, I don't know if it was actually proven, but there were strong hints of sexual abuse with his daughters. He was actually using measurements of certain pieces of his anatomy, shall we say, as sort of like a ruler towards areas on his daughters' bodies. We'll just leave it as that. So when this came to light, it's little wonder really that places all across the UK removed statues of him and other installations that were connected with him. However, the first question that rises in my mind is this ban on Gill's work. Does that actually extend to other artists? And the statue in question at Chalice Gardens was the Mother and Child by Ganesh, and it is said that Ganesh used or may have used Gil as inspiration, which adds or raises a further question: was Ganesh actually aware of Gil's sordid past? So where do we draw the line there? Now, a little bit about Chalice Well Gardens itself. It's owned by a trust or monitored by a trust. And the founder was Wesley Tudor Pole, who established basically the gardens as a peace gardens in the late 1950s, 59, I think. And since that time, it's been visited by hundreds, if not thousands of people. It's a beautiful garden in Glastonbury. And when they were actually excavating it to establish these gardens, it was actually exposed that this whole site has been one of significance for millennia, basically. There was an ancient yew tree stump that was found. There were several dozen sort of flints dating back to Upper Paleolithic or Mesolithic times. There were shards from Iron Age pottery. There's also Roman and medieval shards there. And it may have something to do with the sacred wells. There's the White Well, which is just outside the gardens, and also the sacred Red Well, which has sort of a red tint to the water due to the high iron content that is renowned for its healing properties and is actually inside the garden. So these gardens sort of cater for many people, regardless of spiritual, religious, cultural backgrounds. And the artwork in question, which has caused this big ruckus, mother and child, was one where, and I will share another picture that I have here, that people often visited and sort of turned into an altar because it represents the divine mother and child. So that's either Isis and Horus, or it could be Mary and Jesus, anything like that. So there's a whole array of significance that people have attached to the statue. So hence why people got upset when they heard first that it was going to be removed, well, from its location, but just being sort of put into somewhere else. So what I find of interest when I was sort of looking to find some context as to why they came up with this decision, considering I think the art installation has been there for many decades. And one local newspaper, which I'll link below, which is the Glastonbury Nub News, basically said that the trustees made this decision many years. No, actually, I'll get back. The trustees made a decision despite the statue being donated many years prior. They made a decision based on the revelation of Gil's abhorrent behavior. And it was based around, and I'll put this in quotes, the potential impact this statue could have on some people. Now, that's taken as direct quote from the news article. Whether it is a direct quote from the trustees themselves, I'm not 100% sure. Okay. I personally don't envy the trustees members in making such a difficult decision. And it's also now they're having to deal with this outcry. I've been following this with some interest, as I said, and note that more recently, like in the last few days, a magically orientated friend of mine who is actually a resident in Glastonbury has visited the gardens and actually didn't feel there was any problem in relation to the new location of the statue in question, which I guess is in fact really wonderful to hear. Some people, as she said, don't like change. However, as I mentioned right at the beginning, this whole sort of saga highlights to me a number of other questions, and these questions relate more around triggers and unresolved trauma. And I guess who is ultimately responsible for these? So again, coming back to that quote from the Glastonbury Hub News, the statue was relocated due to the potential impact on some people. Now, there wasn't any indication whether there had been any direct impact, if they had complaints, but the wording was really interesting, shall we say, to me, the potential impact. So at the time of this recording of this video, as I said, I am not aware whether there had been any direct complaints mentioned about this statue, whether their removal or relocation of it was merely done as sort of a preventative action. And this in itself is an interesting sort of question. If it was reported correctly, there's a lot of sort of grey areas here. And these thoughts that go through my head, I just want to make it clear that I'm in no way, shape, or form intending to diminish triggers of any kind or similar kind, because I'm fully aware myself as to how debilitating these can be. But it does raise, in my mind at least, as to who is ultimately responsible when we are triggered. And then how best can we, as a general consensus, deal with triggers? And I guess something of a situation like the Chalice Gardens is a little bit different because it is a public place. So they have to think of everybody in general. But were they sort of erring on the side of caution, maybe too much caution? I don't know. But then it's got me sort of querying, because we live in a world which is triggering. Most of us, if not all of us, have experienced some degree of trauma in our lives, whether we are consciously aware of it or not, and which can have lingering triggers, especially if we have not actually been aware of these events and their impact on us on a more psychological level. We can also be carrying levels of unresolved or even intergenerational trauma that has been passed down our family line, which we are actually currently seeing being played out in the world. This is my opinion, my uneducated opinion, my unqualified opinion, with certain conflicts that are currently taking place. And I'm just going to leave it as that. And it is this intergenerational trauma that an increasing number of psychologists now are recognizing and discussing and are sort of bringing to the forefront. Then added to that, as a collective, we are all affected, especially in these days with more instant and very graphic news stories that tend to get played over and over again because the media companies are after clickbaits. And that is also adding to, I guess, our unprocessed trauma. I listened to an interview with an Indigenous, this is an Native American psychologist last year, I think, and she made a very interesting comment, though she was talking about intergenerational trauma within Indigenous peoples compared with, say, Westerners, is that in more Indigenous cultures had, not say they didn't experience trauma, but they had more different coping mechanisms. And I think she was also talking about colonialism too. So the trauma experienced due to colonialism has only been fairly recently experienced in the greater scheme of things, say 200, 250 years. Whereas, so that's why it's so sort of predominant, it's so noticeable, the impact of colonialization compared to the Western world, where we have had centuries upon centuries upon centuries of suppression, and trauma imposed upon us. If you think about all the wars that the Western culture, Europe has gone through, the breaking down of the feudal system, the bubonic plague, we've got witch burnings, the sort of fights between the Catholics and the Protestants, the migration and the conflict that's been happening over and over again for, I wouldn't say millennia, but for a long, long period of time. And the result of that is that we in the West actually have, I wouldn't say processed that trauma, but when it comes to our stress levels, we are operating on a higher level of sort of stress that we perceive as normal. And this is what she was getting at, to an Indigenous persons who have had a completely different lifestyle and context of how they see the world, to have this Western world sort of thrust upon them. It's very noticeable that it's out of sorts with them. However, for us in the West, since we have experienced this separation for such a long period of time, that often we have not processed it, that's affected. We now see how we operate as normal. So I'm hoping that's making sense. So tying this back into the whole Glastonbury saga is that if we have unprocessed trauma, if we come from a generation of unprocessed trauma, if we've had generation upon generation coming down our family line of unprocessed trauma, how it presents itself, and often later down the track we forget what is the original cause, we just see the result. We see that as normal. And then we add on top of that, we add this sort of, say, patriarchal, this capitalistic viewpoint. It's more than just capitalism. It is a patriarchal viewpoint of, do unto others before they do something to us. That sort of like get them first before they smite us, that sort of attitude. So we have, it's very convoluted, and there's layers upon layers upon layers. So coming back to triggers, how do we deal with them, really? I think this is the question. These are the thoughts which are going through my head with the statue in question. To someone who may not have gone through sexual abuse or any sort of abuse in that context, that statue is just a statue. Whose responsibility is it when it comes to someone else who is triggered by such a statue due to its implications or maybe its connection to it? It also sort of raises questions about our coping mechanisms. Some people may deal with trauma, and as I said, majority of us actually have experienced trauma in one way, shape, or form. Do some of us have better coping mechanisms than other people? Or are we operating merely in a state of denial? And those who are experiencing triggers or who are talking about their triggers are being more open about. And this sort of merges into a wider question, because psychologists seem to recognize that within the first 7 years of our life, this is where very important for our development, our behavioral patterns that we develop that will carry us through into our adulthood. What we experience greatly affects our coping mechanisms there. So it's almost like a flip side too, because it is in this almost fragile, sensitive, delicate period of our life that we experience a lot of unprocessed or unconscious or unconsciously aware trauma. And it's not only, say, the separation anxiety or the abandonment issues that we may experience, say, like our first day at school, or if we're a baby and we're crying and there's no parent there, or we don't see our father or our mother, our caregiver, because they're off working, or if we have been adopted or whatever, And then we have to go to the school and deal or integrate or learn how to establish relationships with people outside our family network. We may have a very dysfunctional family network. We may not even have a family network. So we have all these triggers, all these traumatic experiences that set the foundations, really, of how we deal with life as we get older. Then added to that, there's another layer. We've got this whole concept about energetics. And if you have listened to other videos, I've talked about, we're energetic beings. So we pick up on energy, everything around us is energy. We get carried in our mother's womb. So we pick up on her moods, her emotional state, her mental state. And this has been proven scientifically as well. And added to that, what about the time of our conception? Were we conceived through an act of love, of wanting to be conceived? Or was it through violence? And I don't know if this has actually been sort of fleshed out and looked at a lot in the scientific or psychological areas as well. But I said, from my point of view, considering that we are all energetic beings, I do think even the time of our conception is important to think about. And it's something really that, can I say, certain higher up people who are making decisions should actually be considered, like lawmakers should take into consideration, or maybe they don't take it into consideration when they change laws. We won't go down that rabbit hole. I'm going down enough rabbit hole anyway. So if you're still with me, I think there are layers upon layers, such as our own birthing process, the social or economic status of our upbringing, whether we are fitted into the family dynamics or not, and so much more. So all of these experiences that we go through, which are all relatively normal, whatever normal means, experiences, can end up having a negative or positive, even traumatic effect on us. And as I said, as we are energetic beings, such experiences can manifest later, even if we're not consciously aware of the root cause or the originating factor. And they can originate or be expressed through our actions and also how we see our place in the world. So as I've mentioned, what we're seeing being played out currently in the world, I personally think it is a lot of actions of individuals who have not actually processed trauma, or what we're seeing is directly impacted upon deep trauma, deep intergenerational trauma, traumatic experiences that have been passed down from one generation to the next and are currently manifesting in ways where the victim has actually stepped into the shoes of the perpetrator. The abuser or the abusee has become the abuser. And again, this is something, not saying that it always happens, but it can happen in situations of abuse. Interesting thoughts. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that most, if not all of us, regardless of how we are brought up, how our life is, how it appears to be from the outside to other people, would have experienced trauma in one stage of our life or another. And while many of us have learnt, have developed tools or even processes in order for us to sort of move through such events, maybe even seeing them as learning experiences, or even if we're just operating from a place of denial, the end result is that no one is actually immune from experiencing trauma, nor are we immune from coming across possible triggers, which we seem to circle back to how we cope, how we react, depending on our coping mechanisms, whether it's through therapy, whether it's through shadow work, meditation, journaling, undertaking past life regressions, medication, etc., etc. So at the end of the day, who is responsible for triggers? Is it us? Is it part of our own responsibility for our own lives, especially as an adult? Now, I'm not talking about children because often they don't have the coping mechanisms. And I suppose in this day and age, sometimes we adults don't have the coping mechanisms either. However, we have to come to a stage, I guess, in our life where we are responsible for our lives. While we may not have any control over the actions of others, we are actually responsible for us, how we react to situations, how long we continue with that reaction. Again, I acknowledge that sometimes there are things outside of our control, but we also need to be responsible for us. And I think we're in a society where we quite easily try and palm that off to other people. And in that, I mean, not expecting everybody to take on that responsibility, especially if they're not aware. And I think that's another thing. Even if they are aware, where does that awareness line stop? If we know something is going to trigger us or has the potential of doing that, maybe the onus is actually on us as to whether we're going to subject ourselves to that experience, to that incident, to merely remove us. So in this case, it was a statue because it may trigger somebody. Is that going too far? But they haven't removed, they've just relocated it, which I suppose they're doing the best that they can to sort of appease everybody. So it's a bit of a two-way street. I have another question that's floating around in my head, and because these days we hear a lot about triggers, I also want to know why, and that we never used to hear about them. Is there an increase in sensitivities these days? Are we becoming more aware? Are people finding their voice about things, asserting their boundaries? Are more people listening, being more open to the concept? Is it because we are consciously evolving? So what is being talked about in some circles is making sense. But then there are some spiritual circles where should we go spiritual bypassing is still a big issue, as far as I'm concerned. It's a big issue. There's also a glossing over, especially when it comes to shadow work. Yeah, maybe that's time for another video. And coming back to, why is it so more predominant these days? Is it because people don't have the coping mechanisms that previous generations once had? And all these coping mechanisms that we did have no longer work today. But sort of like vaccinations, how they have to keep changing them, say making them a bit stronger, like the flu vaccination, they keep having to modify it and change it because of the different strands of the viruses coming through. Is it because people are more vocal? Because they can. There's more outlets where they can be vocal. Is it also, or another alternate thought, is this a reflection of how degraded, devolved our society has become? That it's always has been this bad, all this abuse and triggering, but people have been forced to sort of suppress it, contain it. And somehow it sort of popped up like there's only, everybody's cup is full and there's no more pushing it down. And if that's the case, well then really it sort of reflects on a sorry state our species has found itself in. I also find it interesting that there seems to be more socially acceptable traumas than others, or age brackets when it comes to experiencing traumas. It's okay for, say, one age bracket to talk about their trauma, to go on about how they're triggered, compared to other age brackets where people are expected to get over it. So a lot of thoughts, and I know I have gone down rabbit holes, and I do apologize if this has in fact triggered you. I did sort of try and do my best, a bit of a warning. This is how my mind is sort of working on when I heard about, and I'll share it again, all the controversy around the statue of the mother and child, which has probably had nothing to do with what the Chalice Garden Trust even considered. But then that's just how my mind actually has been working with all these sort of questions, unresolved issues. Yeah, so where to now? They've relocated the statue, so you can still go and see it. It does, as I said, highlights to me probably the discussion that needs to be had about trauma and triggering, and how responsible each of us are in the role that we play, not only for our own trauma and our own triggers, but when it comes to the wider community dealing with other people. And then coming back to the mother and child art installation, where we draw the line between the art and the artist. Or in this instance, Ganesh's statue, which really doesn't have anything to do with Eric Gill, except for it may have been or was inspired by him. Because it's sort of in condemning or labeling or connecting Ganesh's statue, it's almost like you're connecting him to Gill and what Gill did in his private life as well. So I will link below the article from the Glastonbury Hub News. An astrologer that I know also mentioned when this issue first came to light, basically when there was no backstory to it, about how sort of like ironic it was that Gill's connection was being sort of condemned, yet in the bookshop there are books by an author her books are very sort of based around Glastonbury, very predominant in the landscape, and mythology is connected with Glastonbury and the tour and Glastonbury's association with Avalon. But when it came to light many, many years ago, back in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, about the abuse surrounding their own child. So if you don't know who I'm talking about, I will link an article about that below as well. So if you are still with me, thank you for letting me sort of air these thoughts. I know I've gone down a few rabbit holes. If you are thinking about the toolkit that you have when it comes to dealing with your own trauma, or maybe subconscious triggering events that you are interested in exploring further. As I said, I do past life therapies, and I do actually have a soul-centered regression taking place this Saturday. So it's the 29th of June, and that is Adelaide time, so that's 9 a.m., which works out to be sort of Friday, 28th of June, say in America, and about midnight if you're in England. You can find out more through, I'll put a link below, but through the Mystical Soul Academy, and I also do private past life regression sessions as well. And it can be interesting to see where we are energetic beings, our emotional attachments to events in the past that we may not now be consciously aware of, but the impact is playing out through our behaviors, through why we do things or why we don't do things, how we see the world, and also sort of shapes our lens, how we see the world as well. So a lot of sort of discussions, a lot of thoughts. I don't know if you have thought about the same thoughts that I have. Maybe you have. If you have any sort of insights, please feel free to put the comments below. I do go back and read them. And yes, when I have a few more thoughts, I might make another video. If you're in Glastonbury, please hope that this sort of controversy doesn't stop you from seeing the Mother and Child or any of the other art installations there. I'm trying to think, the last time I was in Glastonbury was over 10 years ago, and I'm quite sure, I have to go back to my photos, that I stopped and spent time with the statue, because to me it represents that divine feminine, the Great Mother, and the Child, which is all of us. That sort of sacred nurturing that some of us may not have had be fortunate enough to experience in our actual lives. So it's a good sort of substitute. Anyway, I hope you are well and this hasn't triggered you too much. Blessings.